Ceann Comhairle. When I spoke earlier this week, I think it was yesterday, I've lost track of time, I was wary and forgot the word anagram in terms of the Omicron, the new variant, which is further down the Greek alphabet, and inexplicably we missed a lot of the letters that came to that one. And it wasn't I that thought up, when you look on that word as an anagram, it means moronic. It was somebody that came into my office, sat with me and shared her concerns with me. And I think the word moronic is terribly derogatory, really, isn't it? But I look, there are many meanings to it: foolish, idiotic, stupid. And certainly those words characterise many of our characteristics of the government over the last 2 years. And I say that reluctantly, and I say that as someone who actually believes that COVID has been extremely dangerous, that people have suffered from it, all of our families in one way or another, through not attending at funerals, no visits to nursing homes, and so on. It's really unfortunate that we have to preface our comments by that. And that's what we've come to in this country. And so a pandemic was declared on the 11th of March 2020, having declared the outbreak of a public health emergency of international concern on the 30th of January. And the first case in Ireland was the 29th of February 2020. And it's important to put this to say this, because our memories dim after a while. And I was here, and as Deputy McNamara has said, I was near him. I didn't know him that well at the time. I would say I still don't know him, but that's neither here nor there. That's neither here nor there. But I really had a reluctance in passing the legislation, because I knew, and I feared, let's say I didn't know, I feared what was going to happen with no oversight. And I actually said there was no need for a committee, because I foolishly thought the Dáil would retain session really of this and monitor it. And the next battle we had to fight was on the Business Committee, which I'm not on, but I was on it for a number of sessions because I think Deputy Priglin was isolating at the time. And there was a danger that even the Dáil wouldn't sit and that we would get briefings. And we went through all of that, and then the Dáil set for a day or two a week, and we went up on reduced numbers and all of that, and that was the background. And at that time, the language was very inclusive. We were all in it together. And very nice words were said at different times. Minister for Health, Simon Harris, we must protect the most vulnerable members of our society. Varadkar, the question is how we can take what we've learned in recent weeks and some of the things we have done to build a better society in the aftermath of Covid-19, how we can honour the sacrifices made in every community in our country and renew our society by developing a new social contract. Deputy Donnelly, Minister Donnelly yourself, the 19th of March, when we are considering powers as serious and extensive as this, we must, as an Oireachtas, make sure there are checks and balances. Taoiseach Leo Varadkar, when faced with a common foe, we can put aside our differences and work together for the good of the country. Now, very quickly, those sweet words, at the time I expressed my own concerns. I won't quote myself. I'll stay today in the present and look back and see what happened to those lovely words and the meitheal that Deputy McGrath so often mentions, the coming together, bringing out the best in people, and we're all in together. But it started to go very quickly, didn't it? The 70-year-olds were told to stay indoors, and they were told in such a duplicitous way it was appalling. They were led to believe that it was an order, it was legislation from the government, when all the time it wasn't. And indeed, when they dared to step out and go for a walk, we nearly had turned one resident or one neighbour against another, and they would look and say, what are you doing out? You can't be out, you have to be in. Do you remember that, Minister Donnelly? I remember it very well, because it upset me at the time. And then when AstraZeneca, I'm jumping forward and back because I think it's important, when the vaccinations came and AstraZeneca came, the 60 to 69-year-olds were told to take it or leave it, or they would go to the bottom of the list. Do you remember that language? Take it or leave it, or go to the bottom of the list. And then the language started to change in relation to the virus. We personified the virus. The virus became nasty. The night became vicious. Your own words yesterday, I think, was sinister. The possible new variants, sinister. Now, I don't think viruses are nasty, vicious, or sinister. I think people can be nasty. Our policies can be vicious and people can be vicious, but not viruses. By their very nature, they change and alter all of the time, which the experts told us from day one to expect alterations and variations. And I don't have a science background, but I read and I struggle to understand. So this new one is no big change from what we should have been expecting. There will be constant variations. And then the language went on to the distinction between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. And for a while it was very sweet and we encouraged everyone to come forward. And of course, by and large, the vast majority came forward. But then we started to demonise and discriminate. And those that didn't come along were responsible for all the outbreaks. I even heard it today, I think, from a deputy from the Labour Party, who again keeps using this language that's been used out there. The unvaccinated, the unwashed are responsible for the problems. I fundamentally object to that type of language. I don't think that's a way to deal with the threat that's facing us from COVID and the variations that are going to come. It's a public health problem. And I'm going to come back to some of the reasons why it has overrun our country. And then after demonising those who weren't vaccinated, which was only a small group and never a homogenous group, there are many, many reasons, acceptable most of them, why we wouldn't take a vaccination. But we demonised them. And then when the facts sort of made that very difficult, which I'll come back to, we moved from, but in the meantime we brought in COVID passports, supposedly to allow us travel, not to restrict, but to allow us travel. And then those COVID passports were extended to other areas to get you in to have a coffee, to get your hair there. And of course, it begs the question now, like, you know, when you go into a coffee shop and you get a little card and it says you've had 2 coffees today and that's 5, that's 7 in total, you'll get 1 complimentary. And I'm sure you've seen the rounds of the card about Pfizer, you know, tick, tick, tick. And it begs the question, are you now going to have the COVID passport updated to include the boosters? And will you only get access into, and I'm posing these questions because these are questions for discussion. At what point do we stop? Will it be 2 boosters, 5 boosters? Will we distinguish between, well, my colleagues behind me, one has a booster, one doesn't, one can go in to have coffee, the other can't. And next year when another variation comes, will we up the COVID passport again? Something that was meant to be temporary. All of these questions have never, ever been discussed in this stall. Again, I welcome the 20 minutes I'm getting, as I did yesterday, and it's very welcome, and we are discussing the legislation. However, it was published only in the last few days. As we struggle to go through this legislation, and rightly so, because that's my job as a parliamentarian, the Taoiseach is outside doing a press statement to the media, who already know and have already been prepped. And the only, I would say, ignorant, or the only uninformed people are the TDs who are in this august chamber struggling with legislation that's going to give you unfettered powers until March and then again up to June. And the Taoiseach didn't see fit, almost 2 years into a pandemic, to come in and talk to the Dáil, the elected members, to inspire confidence in us so we can go out and inspire confidence in our constituents on the ground and explain to them why this is happening. The testing and tracing. We also brought children. We repeated the mantra that schools were safe, and I believed that. And I believed it. And I actually believe, well, let's say, so now we're masking children. So when the discrimination with the vaccinated and the unvaccinated was wearing thin, we moved on to the children. And now the children are the greatest problem. The children who didn't get COVID, or let's say got COVID but had no symptoms, are now being treated as the greatest threat, not to protect children, but to protect adults. Now, I am no expert here, but I have a difficulty with the changing thing all of the time. It's even changing more than the possible variants of COVID, with the very serious consequences for our democracy. The testing and tracing, the schools have repeatedly pointed out that that was stopped. And you, Minister, and the Minister for Education said, oh no, that didn't happen. But it did happen, and with consequences. In relation to the distinction between somebody who has been vaccinated and somebody who's got COVID and got a cert, and I already raised this with you this morning, I think, and I'm still none the wiser, except there's an EU regulation that says it's only for 6 months, the immunity. Even though I've gone through all of the letters from NPHET to you, and it has been repeated more than once, from HIQA to NPHET, and NPHET accepted it, that it's 9 months. Now, can you just explain to me how NPHET and HIQA are given advice that you accept and you quote ad nauseum, but not this, and no issue and no analysis as to why? I have a difficulty with the bellicose and warlike language that's been used mostly by men, with honourable exceptions. I have a great difficulty. This is not a war. This is a public health crisis because of a very serious virus that's threatening our health, on top of a public health system in terms of hospitals that were creaking at the seams, a primary care system that's non-existent, and a public health infrastructure in terms of public health doctors that are nowhere to be seen. You have never come in here, notwithstanding that we have the Crowe-Haworth report from back in 18 or 19, identifying the deficiencies in our public health. And other than coming in and rattling off numbers in terms of 2.2 extra doctors or something like that, I am none the wiser as to what steps we have taken in a public health crisis to put public health doctors, nurses and experts on the ground to instill trust in the community on the ground. There are very few extra beds. They're way below what has been set out in various capacity reviews, including the review for ICU beds. We are none the wiser in relation to private hospitals and what deal has been done, how much it's costing, and why they haven't been used to more capacity. I don't have time to go through the lists here I have of waiting lists for people in Galway, orthopaedic lists, pain lists, 2, 3 and 4 years. Home help in Connemara, non-existent. The private company can't provide any more home helps for many reasons, COVID being one of them. We have commercialised and made product of our health system. And we've done that for years, and along came COVID on top of that. And then we have the warlike language of adding more tools to our armour to fight this battle, to the front line. To me, we have nurses and doctors that have done great work. So have the cleaners on the ground that have struggled and struggled to keep our hospitals clean. And the porters who have tried to run from ward to ward and ward down to the X-ray department with not enough trolleys. So when we pay tribute to the nurses and doctors, I would prefer if we paid tribute to all of the people involved in our health system who were struggling well before COVID and will struggle well after it until we recognise that we cannot have what we have in Ireland, which is a private system on public money used to completely undermine the public health system. Lately, somebody I know went to Merlin Park Hospital, 150 acres. We should be building a state-of-the-art new hospital in Merlin Park for the 1 million people that the hospital serves. And that person went up to a private facility as a public patient paid by public money to a private facility on public lands in Merlin Hospital for a scan. Such is the complexity of what we have done with the private system into the public system in Ireland. It's extremely difficult to disentangle it. And you say, what has that got to do with all of this? Because it determined how we dealt with COVID when it came along, which was difficult for all of us because it was new. But as the years went by, and it's now years, and we're in our 2nd year, we did not learn. And when I say we, I say the government, and NPHET as well, who is, it's not properly representative of what should be on any committee in relation to mental health, nursing homes, and so on. And then, during that time, we tried to learn because we set up an all-party committee. Deputy McNamara behind me was the chairperson. I took the trouble of reading that, and they have many recommendations in it. They even published an interim report with 22 recommendations, and they talked about many things, but including nursing homes and how an inquiry was necessary. Nothing has happened, of course. We have completely ignored a cross-party committee with recommendations that were practical, that weren't way out. And Minister, I don't think you've ever come in and answered why that was ignored. This piece of legislation seeks to put 4 pieces together, and in theory I have no difficulty with that. It's much better to have one piece of legislation, as long as we ensure enough time to speak about that and the implications of it. However, we've had no input from the Irish Council for Civil Liberties into this legislation. It's never been run by them, nor the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. And there's an obligation on the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission to look at all legislation that has implications for human rights. Utterly, utterly ignored. I almost didn't speak today. I was truly weary of hearing my own voice all over again in relation to this, and I'm sure it's a feeling that's shared by all the TDs on this side of the House. How do we keep saying this? How do we get across that we want to work with the government? We see COVID as very serious, but the restriction on human freedoms for as long, fundamental freedoms, into the second year without any analysis is totally unacceptable and the most serious threat to our democracy. In relation to the redress compensation scheme, or whatever we'll call it, you remember the report that was done by Judge Meenan, I think, in relation to medical negligence generally. And one of the recommendations was that a no-fault compensation scheme would be set up. Do you remember that, Minister? Have you ever pondered on that, thought about that, or come back to us in relation to it? I can't remember, somebody praise, I think it was one of the Fianna Fáil backbenchers, praise Pfizer and the pharmaceutical companies for the wonderful work they have done and the power of private companies to come up trumps. Not a mention of the public money. We still don't know how much. We don't know the nature of the deal, but we do know an indemnity has been given forever and ever. And not a single word of discussion in relation to that little deal. Again, you tell us that was Europe did that, just like they did with the regulation saying you've only 6 months immunity and not 9. But these are basic things that we should be discussing in here. Maybe you could tell us tonight, and if you can tell us tonight, maybe when you're sending me the details of the regulation that says we can only give 6 months immunity for someone who had COVID and not 9, maybe when you've dealt with that paragraph, you might come back to the deal with the pharmaceutical companies. How much public money has gone on to which companies? And then if I draw to a close, I won't go over time, discrimination. I've outlined the discrimination between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated, the discrimination between who could get which vaccination, the discrimination between young and old, and then the ultimate discrimination between us in Ireland, a rich country with 92% vaccinated, and all the other countries that have not even 1 dose of the vaccination. You might explain that to us. You might explain what discussion has taken place in relation to waiving the intellectual property right so that we can all benefit it and truly all of us be in it together. You might explain to us how with 92 or 94% vaccination, depending on which minister or which Taoiseach is talking, we could have such high rates of transmission if the vaccination is so effective. Maybe we could have some honesty about the waning effectiveness of vaccination. Maybe we could have some honesty about telling people to go out, drink and eat and be merry, while there is no day centres and no respite. Maybe you can tell us how people can go out and drink with transmission rates from vaccination, because as I understand it, the vaccination is to prevent hospitalisation and getting sick, but not preventing transmission. How do you explain all of those contradictory messages and tell us that we're all in it together? I go back to the word moronic.
Thank you, Deputy.